digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're coming at you live from Scotland and we have a wonderful array of talent around the table at the moment. That includes, and I'm going to start from the left-hand side of the table, we have Melissa, Tony, Tamia, Mal and Mr. Brian Baglow is back again. What I am going to ask though is for each of you to explain a little bit more about who you are and exactly what you do within the games industry.
My name is Melissa Knox. I'm the producer at Blazing Griffin and I've been there for about 4 years. Yeah.
I'm Tony Gowland. I'm an independent game developer based out of Edinburgh. I've been in the games industry for 18 years or something. Worked at a bunch of different companies, but decided to go indie a couple of years ago.
Hello, I'm Tamia Tabori. I'm an engine programmer in the games industry and also the chair of IGDA Scotland.
I'm Mal Abbas. I'm also an indie developer based in Scotland, also part of IGDA Scotland, and a founder of Biome Collective.
Wonderful.
Hello Tanya, I'm Brian Baglow. I am currently the senior staff writer for Digit, the technology news website based here in Scotland. I'm the director of the Scottish Games Network, the CEO of Jukebox Labs, and Tanya's fallback whenever somebody else can't do this.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was very kind of you to say so. What I actually am going to ask you to do, Brian, is because you are the person who thought up the Scottish Games Network, amongst other things, what I want to do today is talk about the games industry, I'm not going to say in Scotland, but outside of London. Because for those who don't live in the UK, I think there is generally a perception that the core games industry exists within the major cities. And I think it's the same in the US. If you talk about, the movie industry, people tend to think just Los Angeles. They're not really thinking about where else the industry exists outside of those major cities. And so one of the things that I want to do today is really talk about, the industry outside of London and the kind of support that you have. But also, B, I want to talk about whether or not you think that there is a need for more support for people who are outside of the core industry, who are, decentralised or located in other alternative spaces. So, Brian, I'm going to let you start with your thoughts and opinions on this, and then we will expand.
It's a really good topic, and interestingly enough, I think if you look at the breakdown, you look at some of the most recent research, London is not that strong when it comes to video games. Mm-hmm. Many of the major publishers who are currently based in the UK have their headquarters in and around Greater London and the home counties, I guess. But when it comes to development studios, when it comes to the people actually at the coalface making the tools, the tech, the games themselves, I would say probably more than 90% of the UK's capacity exists outside the M25.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting as well because I think that there is a certain lack of knowledge for people who aren't core games industry that actually Scotland, and specifically I'm going to name it Dundee, is a little bit of a hub for the games industry. And I am kind of curious as to whether or not you find that people who aren't necessarily core games industry feel the same way or don't have that understanding that actually there's a really strong community in Scotland, and I'm kind of throwing that out to anybody.
I agree. I think Dundee is definitely a massive hub. I mean, coming to Scotland for the first time myself and kind of entering this games industry hub, I was surprised to find out how much there is here. Obviously, lots of universities providing really good courses, generating more and more graduates who are then making their own companies. So it's a really, really well-sustained ecosystem that just keeps growing. And I think lots of developer meetups in all the big cities. People are, sharing knowledge. They are working together. They're collaborating. And I think it is, a really good hub for game development, both hobbyist, both professional, independent, and the full array there is.
Okay, so one of the things you mentioned there is around education. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a particular reputation for Teesside, specifically, Napier and kind of, I've forgotten the name of the other one, oh my goodness. Abertay, thank you, it just went out of my head. But they do have a really good reputation, and I wonder if there is perhaps a sentiment that there's too much focus around those specific universities. Mal, what's your thought on that?
Possibly. I think Scotland as a country has lots of education institutions, but there's clearly a few that are kind of leading in this sector. But I think a lot are playing catch up. Mm-hmm. A lot are quite intrigued by games development and the process. So I think that is changing slowly. And I think what's also interesting is these institutions like GCU and Abertay, they're also having to adapt and change because the industry is always moving at such a fast pace that big organizations like education institutions are having to to kind of match that kind of change. And what's been good for us, because I'm based in Dundee, I'm part of Biome Collective, and we work quite closely with a whole number of universities across the sector actually, which is quite interesting for us. And what's really cool also is with IGDA Scotland, I mean, last year I think we had 17 events throughout the year. And
for clarity for our listeners, IGDA is the Independent Games Developers Association.
International.
Yeah, so in Scotland we have the Scottish chapter of the International Game Developers Association, which is a voluntary board who put on a whole range of events all year round. And particularly last year and this year, we've really kind of stepped it up in terms of delivering, just really good events in terms of knowledge exchange and networking opportunities for the sector. And what we tend to do, because Dundee is a bit of a hub, but we purposefully go to Glasgow, to go to Edinburgh, and we're also considering the rest of Scotland, the Highlands, and there's so many Stirling, there's so many different places that we're, I think, slowly, hopefully next year and the year after, we'll be able to kind of do more outreach in those areas.
Okay.
It's really interesting that when you look at the people around the table, there's one person here from Dundee. So we actually have a phenomenon called the Dundee nail, which is as soon as you go to university or start a company or get a job in Dundee, you're no longer allowed to leave the city. Mal actually has the pass for today.
I mean, thankfully, what's interesting for me is that I didn't study in Dundee. I'm an outsider who's come to the city. And from the stuff that I do, which is a bit more experimental, is a bit more community-focused work, Dundee, because there's so many mobile studios, bigger studios, that it's allowed myself and other indie developers to start a separate community of kind of more experimental stuff. So that's the good thing about Dundee, is that it kind of the size allows for different stuff, which is kind of cool.
If I can give maybe a little bit of context, Dundee still has more than 50% of all the game development studios in Scotland.
Yes.
However, when you look at the country as a whole, the number of games-related companies is pretty much equivalent in Edinburgh, because we have far more tools and tech companies working in the games industry that aren't necessarily actually making titles, making games. So we have Delta DNA, we have Speech Graphics, we have Cereproc, we have a whole bunch of companies that are working within the game sector but not necessarily game developers themselves. Glasgow, bizarrely enough, is lagging quite far behind. It seems to have far more of a focus, film, television, and the more
creative arts.
The old-fashioned screen industries, let's put it that way.
Yes.
But yeah, it's absolutely a valuable hub. And again, just for a bit of context, we've got 4 universities in Scotland producing games graduates: Abertay, Glasgow Caledonian, University of the West of Scotland, and Napier in Edinburgh. And all of the colleges, which have now been consolidated, so you've got Dundee College, Edinburgh, Glasgow, are all now producing HNC and HND graduates. So the number of people emerging, graduating with game design, development and production qualifications is higher than it's ever been.
Okay, what about Aberdeen?
Nothing of note goes on in Aberdeen unless you work in No, seriously, I have looked long and hard.
So great.
Well, the reason I ask is because you've got that Expo North thing that happens in Aberdeen, so I was kind of curious.
No, it happens in Inverness.
Or is it Inverness? Yeah. I thought it was Aberdeen.
You were there!
What happens in Inverness?
What happens in Inverness stays in Aberdeen. Yeah, Inverness is a bit of an odd one. It has more of a creative industries and digital technology hub. There's several companies up there doing interesting things with VR and AR.
Yes.
Aberdeen, because of the sheer sort of critical mass of energy, oil and gas companies, it tends to soak up all of the technical talent into companies involved in the energy sector.
I do find it interesting though that Inverness seems to have become a little bit of a mini hub for VR and AR based companies, like immersive tech companies. Yeah. I'm not really sure quite why it landed in Inverness of all places, but it does seem to have happened.
Everyone's keen to leave.
We're not saying that people can't leave Scotland, just saying, because
No, Inverness, not Scotland.
No, Brian said Mel couldn't leave Dundee. I'm stating facts here.
People from Inverness basically are far more willing to travel because they have to. People in Dundee look around and go, what could be better than this? Plus there's the bridge, buses stop at 9 o'clock, and
I disagree.
I'd like to point out how wonderful a place Scotland is to develop games.
Yes.
Absolutely. I work at Blazing Griffin. When we opened, we were based in Edinburgh, and 5 years later, we've just opened up an office in Glasgow. A couple of years ago, we bought a film and post-production team, and we needed that space in Glasgow because, as we said previously, the hub for that is here. But my boss came from South Africa and chose Edinburgh very specifically as a place. He was looking all over the world and he chose Edinburgh, Scotland, because it's a lovely place to be. So.
For the record, I did actually used to live in Dundee, so I know what it is to live in Dundee.
You lived in Perth. You used to.
But no, I lived in Dundee before I moved to Perth. I got out.
Okay. I believe you.
So, Tanya, I'm kind of curious because you said you've been in this industry for a long time now. And one of the things that I think is really interesting that we're seeing a trend of in kind of the south of the country is this remapping of skills and talent to be able to give people the opportunity to kind of step into more kind of immersive tech companies, so VR and AR companies, as well as taking gaming talent and transferring that gaming talent into things like the automotive industries or the defense industries or wherever else they're looking for that gaming talent. And I don't know that trend has necessarily kind of made it all the way up to the north of the country. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you have seen any of that kind of conversation around reskilling or kind of shifting skills.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it all comes down to the whole kind of thing of like, okay, all those people coming out of those universities, what are they all going to do? They've all come out with these games degrees. There aren't enough big studios to employ them. They can't all succeed as independent, like sort of five people in a room kind of independent developers. It's like, what are they going to do at that point? You've got these skills. I mean, when you're talking about like Aberdeen and that kind of thing, it's like, well, I mean, maybe a lot of that AR stuff is because there is money there and because there is that kind of interest in kind of applying that kind of tech to broader uses. And certainly, so before I moved up to Scotland, I lived and worked in Yorkshire for 7 or 8 years. So I'm still very kind of connected with like the kind of the hub down there, all like the Gamer.io and all of Games Republic and all of that kind of stuff. And I know that they have like a lot of VR and AR kind of stuff going on there as well. And yeah, I think it's just one of these things of game developers are very resourceful and we're used to like kind of figuring out how to make the most of what we've got, and whether that's from a creative point of view or a money point of view or like, okay, how are we gonna keep this kind of going? It's like we'll figure it out.
I tend to agree in as much as I think people within the games industry tend to generally be quite adaptable because people are very very agile.
After your third layoff, you do tend to figure it out.
It's not exactly a career for life in terms of a single studio job is not going to be your studio for life, and that's kind of expected. But one of the things, and Brian, I know that we've ranted about this many times before, so I'm going to throw this back onto the table again because we've got at least 2 people around this table who are both indie developers. And so one of the things that Brian and I like to rant about every now and then is the fact that whilst there are great developers who are coming out of these universities and various courses that are happening, one of the areas that is lacking is commercial training and actually teaching these young people how to not just make a game, but sell a game and actually understand that they need to have revenue and they need to be able to make money out of the back end of this. And again, I'm going to use the same example I've used in the past, which is at the end of a conference, ironically with Oscar from Unity, at the end of the panel that we did, there were questions, and one of the questions was, why do we have to make money? Can we not just enjoy making games? And I remember my first kind of response was, well, somebody's got to keep the lights on. Who's going to be keeping the lights on? So I'm kind of curious from your perspectives around the table, how much exposure have you had to commercial training? How much of that do you get involved with? Or is it just a case of, look, I'm a producer or I'm a designer or I'm a, whatever your role is, and that's all I really care about is just doing that one thing? Or do you think there is value to actually having a little bit more of a broad scope of understanding some of the commercialization side of the business?
Of course. There's value in everyone in the studio. So there's 20 people right now in my studio. Having them understand why we make specific decisions about we're going to continue developing this game for another 3 months or not. Those are all commercial decisions. As a game developer, we would all work on the games forever. Nothing would ever be done. There's always something else you can do in your game, but at some point you have to leave it, release it, and move on. And I think it's a lot easier to have conversations about development when the dev team understands why we're doing these things from a commercial point of view. So absolutely, and there's definitely not enough of that being taught in university.
So I've actually had a chat with lecturers about this because I'm absolutely on board with that. And what I was told was that kind of if you get like a guest lecturer in of, say, I don't know, someone from like Curve Digital or something, it's like that's an interesting guest lecture, people will turn up to that. If you have a course, like a section of the course that is about kind of the business and making money and all of that kind of stuff, all those students that have gone in this games development course will be like, nah, I'm here for the art, man. I'm not here for this kind of for learning the dirty business side of stuff. And
is that necessarily a good attitude, though? Is does there need to be a shift in perception? Because a lot of these people are going to go out and be independent games developers. They're going to spin up their own game. They're going to chuck it out on the App Store.
Not with no business training, they're not.
And they're not going to know what the hell they're doing, you know?
So what I have started recommend, like whenever kind of student teams kind of talk to me now, I always just recommend, look, you're in the games design, like you're in the games development course on your university. There is a business course in your university. Just find one of those people that likes playing games and get them on your team. Like if your team is a team of 5 games developers, you need that 6th person is someone that has just finished a business degree and that loves games, because having that knowledge of the industry, I think, is super, super important. But that has been trained for that, because doing a single course of like some business development, it's like, it might teach you some stuff, but it's like it's not going to be
we have to be careful that it's not for everyone.
Sure.
There are some people who just want to draw nice pictures all day long and do not care about the end result and the audience engagement, all that kind of stuff. So, but for me, from a freelance kind of indie developer perspective, it's like it's 99% of my work every day is business development more than anything else. So it's really vital. But with us, Biome, there's about 15 of us now, freelance kind of game developers, lecturers, a whole range of people. But not everyone has the same level of business understanding and skills. And we're kind of, by being in a collective, it means that not everyone has to, So we're kind of sharing resources in that regard. Yeah. But I think from universities, I think people need to have at least an element of that introduced to them. And if anyone's interested, encourage them down further, because it is so important. It's if you're going to do indie, that's like you're starting a business more than anything else. You are a business person first and foremost, and so marketing, audience development, business development, all that kind of stuff is so vital. It'll take over your life essentially.
On a related note, I think another thing that games courses currently suffer from, and we know why this is, I think, games is a relatively young industry, and so the education sector needs to kind of catch up with that. And right now, I think the teachings have been focused on really one, you're an artist or you're a designer or you're a programmer, and they're missing the kind of peripheral things that you need to make games go, really. Production is a good example of that. So speaking as a producer, I've done talks at GCU, I've done this, that, and the other, and you'd be surprised how the kinds of questions that come back, it's really clear that they have not been exposed to this at all.
Absolutely.
Nobody's thought about making timeline. When is your deadline? Resource management, these things.
Basic project management skills.
Exactly. So in the same vein as having some basic understanding about what it takes to make a business go, you need to know what it takes to make a game go. And I think there's just pockets of things that are missing from education that would help these kids be more prepared for careers.
But I think that there's an interesting add-on to what you're saying here as well, though, which is it would help if there was a shift in attitude around the education of the games industry when people are in these courses, because one of the things that you'll note, especially with kind of indie studios when they first spin up, is they'll always start out with a CTO, they'll always start out with a CEO and a COO, but what they won't have is a CMO. Or they won't have like commercial people in their team, because they're like, oh, we don't need that. We don't need to worry about that. And it's like much later down the line when they suddenly realize, actually, we can keep on throwing a lot of money at this, but we're not doing it efficiently because we don't understand how to actually advertise this game.
This is one of the problems. We have core skills in the game sector, which is programming and art. And the vast majority of studios are still being formed by the technologists or the creatives, not by people who you would classify as entrepreneurs. Out of all the companies I've worked with over the last several years, there are maybe 3 people that I would say are entrepreneurs. One of them is Melissa's boss, Peter, who, moving from games into film production, post-production is a really gutsy move. And that's because there are opportunities, the crossover and convergence with film, which has access to far more funding than games, but in the UK, by the way, is a very sensible thing to do, to diversify your portfolio. But people get into the games industry to make games. And I've said this to you before, It's when 4 people decide that they're a game studio. It's the poor guy who went to the bar to get the drinks who ends up being the CEO because he has to stop making games and find them an office or learn how to do payroll or, God forbid, do business development. And the attrition rate within the Scottish sector is ridiculous. You know, we're looking at between, I think it's 30 to 40 companies we've lost over the last 3 or 4 years, simply because their idea was make a game and hope it goes all Angry Birds.
Oh yeah.
Even Rovio aren't managing that anymore. You know, so it's one of these harsh realities. Is we have to recognise that not everybody gets into the games industry to make money, right? You can go in, you can make games for art's sake or because you really feel the urge. That's cool, but if you want to make it your livelihood, at some point you're going to have to realise somewhere down the line somebody's going to have to give you money.
It reminds me of the very first person that kind of got me into the games industry, and one of his sayings was that he didn't want my interest in the games industry to be a hobby out of control. He wanted it to be a career. And that's kind of, I think, the difference here is that whether or not somebody's an enthusiast and has that passion for it, but isn't really thinking about, okay, how do I make a long-term career here, versus people who are thinking about that as a long-term career.
Absolutely, and the thing is, you can now make games in your spare time. The tools and technologies are out there to allow people who work in banks, and I know a lot of people who are IT specialists in other areas who make games in their spare time as a hobby, and they're not really fussed about making games. But for a lot of people who are coming out of the game-specific courses, and again, just to reiterate what Tony said earlier, Abertay has something like 800 game students at the moment. That's pretty much 2/3 of the entire workforce in Scotland. So they're either going to have to leave, go into another sector, leave the country, or increasingly the opportunities are entrepreneurial, so set up on your own. And the problem is, especially here in Scotland, is there's actually a lot of help out there.
There really is.
There's an awful lot of help. Business Gateway, Scottish Enterprise, the Cultural Enterprise Office, yada yada yada.
Prototype fund.
Prototype fund.
The thing
Scottish
is, there's always money. It's just a case of people not knowing where to connect to get that money.
I disagree. Sorry, Mum. I think one of the problems is that because we have all of this help and all of this infrastructure, and because within those organisations, the public sector organisations, there are people who don't get games. In some cases, games companies get a free pass. It's like, your games, great, that's creative industries. Oh, we need more of you. Check, welcome to the high growth pipeline.
Yeah.
I've had almost exactly the opposite experience of that. When I've talked to Business Gateway, the people that I've been in touch with at Business Gateway don't know games, they don't understand it. SDI, love them. A lot of their stuff and like a lot of the forms that they ask you to fill in, they're
not designed for people in the games industry.
So, as an example, these are things where they're kind of saying to you, okay, we want to grow your international trade. What's your current international trade? I'm like, well, I'm selling a game on Steam, so 80% of my revenue is international. And they're like, right, in 3 years' time, what's your international trade going to be? Probably 80% again. Oh, so your international trade isn't growing? Well, yeah, but it's already 80%. It's like there's a lot of these things are like it's the setup for
They're very helpful about it, though. They're really helpful about it. We have received loads of funding from Scottish Enterprise, the Prototype Fund, and Creative Europe is one of note. Specifically, their application form is horrendous. And because it's built for film, and so they try to retrofit, things that just don't even belong into a game. But in Scotland, anyway, the people at Scottish Enterprise are incredibly helpful. So if I'm filling out a new kind of like an R&D form, and I call and I'm like, I'll not name drop, but we've lots of very helpful account execs. When I call and I say I need a help with this thing, for us anyway, they have always been really forthcoming.
Scottish Enterprise are really.
Mal's trying to say something. I'm gonna go with Mal on this.
It really depends on the scale of business you are. I think the smaller businesses, these guys coming out of uni or guys at Witch Transport or Biome Collective, it's actually Business Gateway who they have to go to. That's the entry point. And Business Gateway, they understand brick and mortar business. They don't understand digital businesses, let alone games development, right? I think people like Scottish Enterprise, they have some amazing people, but still they're not set up for our fast-moving industry, right? But the point I was going to go back to earlier was there is support, and it needs to be improved, like everything needs to be improved. But I think the biggest gap I see is a lack of mentorship for our industry, because I think we have a very young industry, and unfortunately a lot of people leave the industry through crunch and bad management, a whole host of reasons. And I think we need to be able to look after our sector in much better ways through health and well-being and mentorship in particularly. Like I found it easy to find mentorship because I just email people and set up coffee meetings, and I've got a very good support network around me. But I've done that by myself. There are people who aren't able to do that, and so it'd be wonderful if we're able in the future to provide that for the sector.
But you know, one of the things I find really interesting about the games industry in general, though, is that it is very open, it's very friendly, and
Absolutely.
people, you know, everybody knows everybody else. It's a community, it's a family, and so for the people who aren't reaching out for mentors, I think that's a lot to do with their perception and their fears about reaching out to people, because if they did reach out to people, I'm reasonably confident that 90% of people they reached out to would be happy to help.
Absolutely.
This happens informally, right? It's the community we have here in Scotland, and the community in the game sector pretty much worldwide. When I've been out talking to people, very rarely do you come across somebody who's like, I'm far too busy and important to talk to you.
Exactly.
And questions will usually be answered, and networking tends to be far simpler in the game sector than anywhere else, where you can get CEOs or executives.
It's ego-free, isn't it?
Yeah. To a great degree. Not completely, but certainly to a very great degree. But we don't have the formal routes into the industry. You know, we have guest lecturers, we have various links between the academic institutions and the game sector, but we don't have the graduate level apprenticeships that other areas do. We don't have the routes in. You know, testing used to be pretty much the way that a lot of people got into the game sector, but as that's more and more outsourced to third parties, you know, we're not making it easy for all these graduates to find the companies that are hiring.
You know, it's interesting you say this, because I think that there is a reasonably obvious route for somebody who is training from a programming and development perspective. If you go and you learn coding and you learn, you know, how to do the development side of things. But actually on the commercial flip side of this, if you go to any of the major studios, in fact, any indie studio for that matter, and you speak to people in the commercial team and say, how did you get into the games industry? Most of them are going to say to you, by pure accident. It was not, you know, it's not a design. It's not a plan of action that, you know, you leave university and kind of, I'm going to go to the games industry and be part of it. It tends to be people stumbling into the industry, especially on the commercial side of the fence. So when you talk about this kind of lack of clear path into the industry, I think that there is a bit of a problem when it comes to non-technical roles within the games industry as to how the hell do you even start?
And I think even within technical roles, like, you know, just there seems to be this big gap between education and professional people, where like all of us, you know, in the games industry talking about how easy it is to reach out to people and like find mentors. But like, I remember my student years, and definitely all the students I talk to these days are still in the mindset that like, I can't reach out to developers, you know, and there's this big, it's equally, like earlier, I think we mentioned how like so many people in the games industry are really adaptable and really flexible, but those kind of flexible skills are exactly what's kind of missing from games education. So that again, that big divide between students and professionals, like once you make that leap somehow by accident, you're cool, but making that leap is the difficult part. And I don't know if it's education's place to fill in more of that kind of filler material into the courses, or it's more professional people's jobs to reach out to students, because there are a bunch of networking events where we are mixing. It's just that maybe it's intimidating for students to reach out. I don't know.
Do you know what, though? Part of it for me is doing it properly as well. And I think part of this does need to come from universities. We just got an email the other day to JobsAt that was basically, it said, hi, can you let me know of any vacancies you've got? Thanks. It's like, listen, we get hundreds of emails a day asking for jobs at our company now, which is great. But, you know, how is it that this person who thinks that they're prepared for the professional world doesn't understand that sending an email that doesn't have your CV attached, that doesn't tell me what you do, that hasn't bothered to look at our website to find the vacancies, that thinks that that's the route in? There's something fundamentally missing there, and I wish that email was the only one, but it's not.
But perhaps, so controversial opinion, perhaps that's not something that's missing in their education. If all students were like that, I would agree with you.
Yeah,
but perhaps, perhaps some people just aren't cut out for the games industry, but if they don't get a job in games,
where do
then
they go? Because
do you know? But I get what Melissa is saying there, in as much as I think that there is a certain degree of naivety, is the word I'm going to use, when it comes to how to get into the industry or how to approach people. And I don't know if that isn't necessarily more of a social education thing, like what's okay to do and not okay to do, and how do you approach somebody in a social setting kind of thing. Because the games industry is very informal. It's not like you turn up and you do like a proper interview kind of thing. It's like, Silicon Drinkabout, that evolved as a recruitment tool for people to get together and have a drink and talk to prospective companies. And for some people, that's really awkward, like going in and having a drink with somebody and learning how to kind of socialise, but at the same time advance the possibility of your career. It's actually quite a particular skill set. But Brian, what you going to say?
It's very true. There's no lack of events. There's no lack of opportunities to go out and actually meet people. I've done a lot of talks at most of the universities and some of the colleges, not just in Scotland, but across the rest of the UK. And it is remarkable when you go in and ask, so you want a job in the games industry, okay, who around your particular university, who's recruiting, what companies are there? And the number of times there's just dull surprise.
Yeah.
I had one person last year going, oh, it's fine, I'm going to join Real Time Worlds. And
Really? Oh, really?
Is that the same one that went out of business in 2010? And they went, no. Genuine. But I think a part of this is down to, yes, it is absolutely the individual, but the industry as a whole is so informal that we don't have the same criteria. With film and television, if you look at those, because they are somewhat comparable, you have huge organisations, Pact, Beck2 and so on, that define the roles and define how you get into the industry and essentially lay out all of these different criteria for your job within film, television, whatever it happens to be. I'm not saying we go that far because, a producer in one company can mean something wildly different to another company, and as everybody's been pointing out, you now need to become far more multi-skilled, especially at micro studios. But by the same criteria, the universities themselves, I think, are creating artificial barriers and some insularity between students. You're working on games for several years with like-minded people. You've got artists and programmers and producers and everything all around you, and yet none of the stuff you're making ever hits the market. I think it absolutely insulates students from the real world and the experiences which they will get when they come out, which is, doesn't matter that you spent a year and a half working on something, you've poured your heart and soul into it, and then it comes out and the only person that downloads it is your mum. Right? Why are we not putting stuff out? Why are we not getting it out there? And why aren't we championing it, quite frankly? Look at the stories. They are few and far between, and they are now receding into the past, but that games company came from a student project called Flow. Portal came from the Bacula Drop, which was a student project. We've had Dare, we've had Protoplay, we've had all of these opportunities. We've got the Glasgow Game Jam. The one that kind of strikes close to home, given that we're in Glasgow, is the guys at No Code Studios. They entered the Global Game Jam back in 2013. They did Love versus Dub, which came out, ended up being a Starbucks Game of the Week.
Starbucks Game of the Week.
And they've now gone on and set up their own studio. It is possible, but it's just having that desire to get stuff out and put it in front of people, and the recognition that if we don't do this, we're never going to know about that whole side of the process of making and releasing games.
Well,
I'd say we've talked a lot about the educational institutions, but I think there's the industry has a lot to answer for too as well. I think there's we need a lot more leadership from the industry to be able to come together and address some of these problems, because we're all suffering from the consequences of all these issues as business people, as game makers, etc. And I think it's about time the sector tried to kind of come together. And especially in a place like Scotland, I think we're small enough to be able to do that and do it quite well. So I'd like to see that happen in the near future, because these education institutions, they can only do what they can do, and they've got their own agendas. And they're essentially big corporations themselves. So there's only so much we can ask of them, I think. And I think the way I see it is there's so much opportunity in games. It's amazing. Like, I get to do weird and wonderful stuff, and I'm totally sustainable. I get to pay the bills, make weird games, make awesome games, collaborate with amazing people, and it's totally doable, right? And so I'm trying to encourage more people in our sector to just to have a go and kind of take the risks, sort of thing.
But also the fact that the talent skills that you have within the games industry are so useful elsewhere. And
absolutely.
So many other vertical industries are looking for that talent right now, and even things like the VR and the AR industry, desperate for games industry talent.
I think what I've realised is our process through games design, games development, is that we consider the player or the audience a lot more than other sectors do. So our work actually has the potential to be a lot more accessible than a lot of other sectors. You get you buy a brand new TV set and the UI is terrible. It's clunky and terrible. It's like, it's the kind of thing we think if a games developer was part of this process, that would not get passed. That's not happening. So I think we have so many amazing skills and talents that we can kind of map to other sectors. It's quite remarkable.
Can I pick up on that, because this is one of my pet peeves, which is we absolutely should be doing that. When it comes to the blend of technical skills and creativity, game developers should be running the world, or at least doing an awful lot more in the creative industries than they are. But in a lot of cases it comes back, again, I think it comes down to people get into the games industry to make games. And far too many game studios are facing, failure, closure, liquidation, administration, rather than look outside the experiences they're comfortable with. When you look at the digital market, the digital agencies, you talk about all the big, the people who are working with the advertising companies, the brands, the broadcasters, and the magazines, and the fashion brands, and so on. Most of them are now development studios. They have a development studio capability. There is absolutely nothing to stop game studios doing that, apart from it's not a game, I don't fancy doing it, I'm not going to be able to collect coins, rescue princesses, or blow stuff up in a cool way. So it's not really our thing. And so there's a huge amount of money that's going to other companies, not in the game sector, that I think the games industry across the whole of the UK could and should be hoovering up, because it would improve an awful lot of the experiences that are out there, which are functional, fulfilling, brief, maybe tick a marketing box, but aren't necessarily engaging, compelling, or fun in the way that I think game developers would be able to introduce.
Okay, so whilst we're all sounding very elitist,
Speak for yourself.
I'm just saying, what I would like to ask is, what do you think is that one big thing that kind of needs to shift or change within the games industry in Scotland? Be that a cultural thing or a technological thing, what would be the one thing that you would like to see kind of shift? And we'll start with you, Tony.
I think it is that mentorship that was mentioned earlier on, that kind of leadership, mentorship. I would like to see kind of the heads of the companies that have done well in Scotland kind of basically form together and kind of help lift other people up, rather than just kind of go, we're all right, see you later.
Okay. Tania?
Yeah, I mean, I think gonna be echoing a lot of what has been said, but just kind of to expand on Tony's point, I guess, is that, yeah, like once you're in the games industry, I don't think you can stop thinking about how you can improve your little corner of the world. And I think all developers should be going out of their way to champion things like diversity and reaching out to new audiences and work together with people of different backgrounds. And I don't think that's being done enough anywhere, in the games industry. But obviously, Scotland being our part of the world, we can start here.
Okay, Matt?
I think if there's one thing, it's got to be for the sector to do more cultural work, work with people who are not within the games bubble, and so really open the doors for collaboration for people who don't even play games, to be honest with you. I think that would lead to just amazing work to be created.
Okay.
I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is a focus on keeping the talent that we have in the games industry. I think one thing that the industry suffers from actually is burnout at quite an intense level as well. And I think the reason that the industry isn't growing as quickly as it can is because the people who have the experience are leaving for very good reason often. And so I think it's important that we focus on, yes, we're making games because we love them and we should keep that passion there, but also remember that people need to have lives and they need to have breaks, and it is a business, so it's important that we be professional and treat our people like people. So I think keeping that experience in the industry would change a lot of things subtly, but it would make for a better industry for everyone, I think.
Okay. And Brian?
I think we need to stop making games.
What should we make instead?
I'm not saying that we necessarily drop the whole games thing, it's quite nice, but I think the problem is that this idea of getting into the games industry to make games, and that's the focus, 100% making games, and it stops people getting any kind of perspective. It puts them right in amongst the trees so they can't see the wood. And I think that's why a lot of the issues that the other guests have raised kind of all comes back to, which is, the lack of mentorship. It's because the industry hasn't actually realised there's value in having a graduate programme and mentors to allow people through. The lack of companies going out and doing anything in the broader cultural sector is because it's scary, it's not games, and there might be forums. The burnout is down to the fact that you don't see many other industries running into the same burnout problems as games. That's because most companies are operating a little more professionally, shall we say, and so it doesn't tend to happen. And we're stuck in this mindset that games happen the way games happen because that's the way games always happen, and we're not innovating. And for a company that's constantly driven forward and constantly evolving thanks to new technologies, routes to market, business models, it's a deeply conservative sector. And I think we need to take that step back and go, actually, you know what, guys, this isn't working. Let's change it.
Okay. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about what you're up to. We ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be?
Melissa, just wanted to tell you my name there in case you didn't know who it was from me speaking. As the only female American, Melissa Jo Knox is my Twitter handle. It's just my name.
My Twitter handle is Freakyzoid.
Freakyzoid. Fun.
My Twitter handle is also just my full name, Timea Tabori. That's TIMEATABORI.
Oh, maybe I should have spelled mine.
So my personal one is Maltron3D, and also Biome Collective, also on Twitter.
You can find my personal Twitter handle at Flackboy, or you can follow the Scottish Games Network at Scottish Games.
Wonderful. And Melissa, do you want to spell it out?
Oh, okay, I can, sure. It's MELISSAJOKNOX.
Thank you very much. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com